This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 21st, 1913, the very first crossword puzzle was published on the fun pages of the New York World newspaper. This was the invention of a British journalist, Arthur Wynne, who'd been living in the United States since the 1890s or so. And I don't think I need to convince you, listeners, that the arrival of the newspaper crossword is a momentous occasion. And as we'll get into, crosswords and word puzzles become a total sensation over the next 2 decades. And we are now once again living in a golden age of puzzles. But also, this first crossword puzzle maybe helps us understand a moment in newspapers as well, a time when tabloid journalism was taking off. There's a lot of pressure to find new readers and new eyeballs. So let's talk about the first crossword and why we have loved puzzles ever since. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And our very special guest for this episode, and actually will be on for the next episode as well, is the great A.J. Jacobs. He is one of my favorite authors, the man behind books like The Year of Living Biblically and Drop Dead Healthy, and also the book and new podcast called The Puzzler. AJ's book is all about the world of puzzles, and his new podcast is a short daily puzzle podcast where he presents a series of fun and challenging puzzles for you to play along with at home. It is really great. It comes out every single day from iHeart. AJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. And if I can go with a little more holiday gratitude, yes. Thank you for producing The Puzzler. You are, people listening know he's a brilliant co-host, but he's also a brilliant behind-the-scenes producer, editor, everything. So
I appreciate that, and I was about to do the sort of full disclosure about our conflict of interest because I don't want the podcast SEC to come after us for conflict of interest here. So yes,
I blew your cover.
My production company, Roulette Productions, is the producer of that new podcast, and the great Brittany Brown, who produces this show, also helps produce The Puzzler. So yes, it's all family here. It has been really, really fun. AJ and I have known each other for a while, and I will always jump at a chance to work with AJ. And so, yes, go check out The Puzzler, both because it's a great show and also because, I make it. So
shameless plug. Shameless plug.
There you go. So look, AJ, I mentioned that you're going to be our guest for 2 episodes. And next episode, you're going to talk about puzzles and maybe how they help us understand World War II. But let's go to 1913, just on the cusp of World War I. This first puzzle appears in the New York World. And I guess my first question is, have you done it? Is it any good of a puzzle?
I have done it, and it is not good.
Okay.
The short answer is it's a terrible puzzle by modern standards.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
So I'm very grateful for the guy who invented it, Arthur Wynne, Wynne, who you mentioned. But the first of any art form is not as Pong, not the greatest video game.
Wow, fighting words right out the gate. Controversy.
All right. We can do a whole other episode on debating Pong. But anyway, I can tell you why it was not great, but it is by modern standards. We should be grateful that it has evolved into a much better puzzle.
Was it not great because it was too easy, or not great because it was too hard, or
a little of both? First of all, it had a lot of super obscure clues, which are really not fun in crossword puzzles. So, for instance, 10 down was the question was, "This is the fiber of the gamuti palm," and yeah, it's a 3-letter answer.
To be fair, this was during the Gamuti craze of 1913, which we've covered on this show.
That is true.
I forgot that. Yes. See, that's why it's good to be on a history podcast. Well, the answer, just so you know, the answer nowadays would include Homer Simpson's outburst, a 3-letter word. Dope. D-O-H. So that was one problem. Another problem was that a good crossword puzzle now has very clever wordplay. Mm-hmm. That, to me, is what marks. And this had practically zero wordplay. So they had 10 down. The clue was a bird. That was literally the clue. And the answer was dove.
No.
And then to make it even worse, dove appeared twice in the same crossword puzzle, which is a no-no in modern. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I forgive Arthur Wynne, even though it was terrible by today's standards. People loved it back then.
But it's recognizable as a crossword puzzle. I mean, it's the first of an art form which persists to today.
It is. It looks a little different. It's diamond-shaped instead of square. It doesn't have the black boxes. Mm-hmm. But it does have the down and a cross, and it was called crossword. Actually, to be technical, it was called word cross. Mm-hmm. And then, because of a typographical error a few weeks later, it switched to crossword. So, as I tell my kids, sometimes mistakes can be a good thing.
Except for in crosswords.
Yeah, right.
Good point.
Well, I think we should also talk about why crosswords appear in 1913, because this is as much a media story as it is a story about games. Listeners will have heard of the idea of yellow journalism, all of these mass circulation newspapers that are trying to get readers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And we often, when we talk about yellow journalism, it's usually in this very accusatory way, right? Like they're ginning up war with Spain. They're lying to their readers. They're preying on their emotions. But it was also doing things like this, like putting things into the newspaper that people would look forward to. So things like comic strips, which appear in the late 19th century, or crossword puzzles. And it really becomes a way of selling newspapers, and it becomes a fad. Like people become, fads may be the wrong word, a craze. People go crossword crazy in the 19-teens and 1920s in this way that's like, I mean, I'm a little crossword crazy myself, but I don't have like crossword socks, which is something that was like big in the 1920s, right? Like people wanted to brand themselves as crossword addicts in a way that I find very funny and fun.
I love that.
I was going to say, it's the pickleball of 1913.
That's right.
Ooh, well done. Like exactly.
And the
or
Wordle.
even the Wordle. Yeah.
The Wordle,
yes.
exactly. It's the puzzles.
I love what you say. I want to pick up on both of those themes. But first, I do want to talk. I love what you say about yellow journalism, because in one way, it was very sensational. There were these huge wars. This was Joseph Pulitzer was the owner of the New York World. His big rival was William Randolph Hearst. And they had this newspaper war, and they got sensationalistic. There was a lot of lurid crime. There was articles about aliens on Mars. Scientists prove aliens on Mars. But they also had this creative side. And they also actually had a muckraking side. So they really were a voice for the people, a voice for tenement conditions. They would do exposés. But they also had this like you said, the comics. They had one of my heroes, Nellie Bly, who was this wonderful journalist who was famous for doing stunts where she would, when the book Around the World in 80 Days came out, she went around the world in 80 days, and this was before airplanes, of course, and wrote about it.
A.J. Jacobs of her day, yeah. You would have done that if you were around in 1913.
Maybe. I think
right?
she's a little more legendary. But, but yeah, so they were very creative, and this was one of the things they did was puzzles, and they leaned into it. And there is a great book that was put out by Nicholson Baker a couple of years ago called The World on Sunday, which I highlight. It's a coffee table book of all their super creative illustrations.
Yeah, well, I mean, to that point, the New York World, I mean, it's not the New York Times, it's not the Post. I mean, this is a moment. Can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of like newspaper media landscape? And this is the start of an era where there's like 30 different daily newspapers in New York, essentially, right? I mean, It's kind of wild.
Well, Nicole might know more, or Kellie. What I know is just, it was cutthroat, and they were looking to expand. The New York Times had sort of the highbrow audience, but but there were, as you say, dozens of newspapers. But the two that really got mass circulation were the New York World and Hearst's, which was the New York Journal or Journal American. It had different names. And actually, the name yellow journalism comes from a comic strip character in the New York World, later stolen by Randolph Hearst, named the Yellow Kid. And I think it was supposed to be sort of from the tenements. I think that the kid was. So that was a little bit of their vibe. They were not going for the highbrow. They were going for the people.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
When you have all of these newspapers and the environment is so saturated, you really do have to come up with different sort of gimmicks, if you will, to get people to want to buy your newspaper, to want to not just buy it, but tell others about it, to look forward to it. And crossword puzzles are also something that can be both individual, but also collective. You know, you might work on it by yourself, but then you might be in a room full of people and you're like, hey, guys, what is this? You know, like you might call out the clue and get other people to sort of join in. So it's something that can kind of spread very quickly if you allow other people to participate.
There is this real community aspect to it, especially as it catches on, because, you know, most people don't know people have Google at their fingertips. And most people don't have like a big Oxford English dictionary sitting around their house. The appeal of these newspapers was cheap newsprint made them very, very, very affordable. And so you could have this mass circulation. But what it meant was that as this trend takes off, you have lines outside of the public libraries where people are like trying to get access to the dictionaries so they could look up terms and look up clues in order to finish their crosswords. And that too is a kind of community thing, right? Can you imagine standing in line for the dictionary where you all have like your paper and your pencil and your crossword? It does seem to have this kind of very social atmosphere around it when we often think of puzzles as kind of a solitary endeavor. But I love that idea, Kellie, of the community behind it.
Me too. And that is part of my pitch as a puzzle evangelist, that they can really bring people together. And I saw Josh Wordle speak at the American Crossword Puzzle Convention, which is Josh invented Wordle. And he tells stories about how there was a gay man who wrote him because he was able to bond with his conservative Christian mother over Wordle. So the idea is puzzles can bring people together. They can save the world.
Josh Wordle's last name is really Wordle?
Well, it's
W-A-R-D-L-A.
Wordle. Wordle. But yes, not too far to create a last name with word in it. But, you know, I want to talk a little bit about the modern puzzle craze in a second. But just on that community note, I mean, I think of HQ Trivia, which was like, you know, I remember when that was a craze, like you'd be in a bar and people would just stop and do it together, you know? And I was like, wow, you know, it was one of the few examples I could point to of like a sort of cell phone actually bringing people together in the real world, you know, rather than atomizing them. But it was incredible. I want to get, of course, to the parallels to today. And AJ, you trace the sort of history of puzzles and the puzzle craze. But like we've sort of hinted at it. And I know you have so many great stories and examples of just what the puzzle mania in the teens, 20s, and 30s looked like. So what are some of your favorite moments of that?
I mean, what I loved was one of the only papers that did not print crosswords was the New York Times. Instead, they printed all of these articles about what a pestilence. Crosswords were a scourge on society, and it was almost like the way the tabloids covered the crack epidemic in the 80s. It was like, it was husbands were murdering their wives. It caused a prison riot, said one article. It was Olympic athletes, American Olympic athletes were foregoing their training and doing crossword puzzles instead. So it was bad for America. And it is funny to see this happens several times throughout history. The moral panic. When there is a puzzle craze, there are these moral panics. There was a similar one about jigsaw puzzles during the Depression, and a preacher who said, "Well, Nero fiddled while Rome burned, and we are doing jigsaw puzzles while our country collapses." So there was this moral element to it. Oh, and then another proof of just what a craze it was is you had all this pop culture created out of it. So you had a Broadway show about crossword puzzles. You had a hit song called Crossword Mama, You Puzzle Me, but Papa's Gonna Figure You Out, which I love that. I love that song.
That gets sung at every Crossword Society convention.
Yes, it's become sort of an anthem of.
Yeah, I believe it.
Although I do think, from a gender point of view, you can switch the genders, but yes, the idea is people can be a puzzle.
I love it because the moral panic. We did an episode on is it pinball machines?
Yeah,
caused a lot of moral panic as well, and how when you get this craze, you think that people will be all on board, but there's always someone that's going to turn it into some sort of sinister idea. It's meant to distract you from what you're really supposed to be doing, or distract you from work, or whatever it is.
Right, and the that painting, I think it's called Gin Lane, where it was during the gin craze, and it has mothers and parents drinking gin and neglecting their kids. You saw the same thing whenever there's a puzzle craze. So you have cartoons during the jigsaw craze of mothers neglecting their kids to do jigsaw. So yeah, it's a threat to our society and our families.
It's so funny because I think that there's also a strong parallel to the video game panics. And the reason that I wanted to bring that one in as well is because video games are related to the tech boom of the 1980s and 1990s. And I think of crossword puzzles as kind of, people sometimes don't know quite where to sit with them because they're an intellectual activity, but they're not necessarily learning in the same way. So it's intellectual adjacent. In the same way that video games are tech adjacent. And I think people are well, if you actually used your time doing reading a book or learning to program a computer, that would be a better use of these sort of this way that you're using your skills frivolously, as opposed to putting them toward bettering mankind or what have you.
Well, which I, of course, as Jody knows, I argue that doing puzzles actually does make us better people and allows us to think in more creative ways and solve problems. And actually, one of my favorite quotes is from Quincy Jones, the music producer, who says that he says, "I don't have problems in my life. I have puzzles." So he reframes problems as puzzles, and it's more inspiring and solution-oriented if you look at it that way.
I'm going to make sure that my son does not listen to this because he has been wanting a PS5 for the longest, and he's like, "Mom, it's going to help me with problem solving and hand-eye coordination."
Amazing.
Sure.
He's a good sell.
Hilarious.
Well, yeah, it's clearly helping him with logic and debate.
Right?
There you go.
There you go. All right. So as we wrap up, I will say one little tease, which is AJ mentioned how the Times was reluctant to get into crosswords. Next episode, we will start with the Times finally getting into crosswords in World War II. So tune in for that. But if we can all take a step back, I'm just curious, and struck by the parallels to now, not just the fact that we seem to be in another kind of crossword craze in the 2020s, when we were in the first one in the 1920s. But I wonder, AJ, if that also helps you think through the many ways in which people see parallels between the 1920s and the 2020s. We have a sort of fracturing global order and pandemics and, new media environments and destabilization. Do crosswords help us understand why it might feel like there's this 100-year cycle going on?
It's a good theory. It is possible. I will say I mean, there are a lot.
My job is to posit BS theories and then let the actual experts, try and piece it together.
You read puzzle historians, and there are puzzle historians, and they say that often these puzzle crazes occur during times of stress, like the Depression for Jigsaw Puzzle and the pandemic, of course. Possibly, I think there is some causation, but I think most times in history are stressful, depending on who you talk to. So I'm not sure. We're seeing an exact echo of the puzzle craze 100 years ago, but I do think it's interesting to compare and contrast. One thing I love about the golden age of puzzles right now is that it's much easier for independent puzzle makers to create and trade puzzles, like with the internet and 3D printing. And that you didn't have as much back then. You had them in big newspapers like The World and the New York Times. But now you have creative puzzle makers, whether they're coming up with movie-themed crosswords or crosswords tied to identity like Black Crosswords or Queer Crosswords, both of which are companies that put out their own puzzles. So that, I think, is a relatively new phenomenon and one that I think is great. The more people making puzzles, the better.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It makes me think that that's one of the kind of real silver linings of a fractured media environment, is that also people can find their own. They can find their home and they can find their community in that way. And I guess puzzles reflect that too. I will say you spend a lot of time in your book, The Puzzler, exploring those various communities, and our podcast, The Puzzler, tries to kind of highlight those pockets as well. So the most important thing, AJ, we did was turn it into a plug for your book and the podcast.
So success. I love it.
Well, we will leave it there with AJ Jacobs. Very interesting, and we will pick up the puzzle story next episode. But again, AJ Jacobs, author of many wonderful books, including The Puzzler and then the podcast, The Puzzler, out daily from, Roulette Productions involved as well. But AJ, thank you, and we will see you next episode.
Thank you.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Crossword, mama, you puzzle me. The papa's gonna figure you out. You call me honey, and that means be. Looks like I'll be stung, no doubt. You go out calling for an hour or two. I don't know where or when or how or who. Crossword, mama, you puzzle me. The papa's gonna figure you out.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software, or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Radiotopia.
From